Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. In the heart of the 15th century, a city stood as the last bastion of a 1,000-year-old empire. It was called Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, the envy of the world, protected by walls once thought to be eternal. But on the horizon, a new power was rising, led by a young, ambitious sultan with a singular, all-consuming obsession to conquer the city that had defied his ancestors for generations. This is the story of two empires locked in a final, desperate struggle. It is the story of Sultan Mehmed II and the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI. It is the story of faith, ambition, gunpowder, and steel. The story of the siege that would shatter the medieval world and give birth to a new age. This is the fall of Constantinople. By the middle of the 15th century, the Roman eagle was no longer soaring, it was dying. The Byzantine Empire, the inheritor of Rome's 1,000-year legacy, was a ghost haunting the ruins of its own magnificence. Its heart, the legendary city of Constantinople, was less a thriving metropolis and more a vast, hollowed-out museum. Within the colossal embrace of the Theodosian walls, a marvel of ancient engineering that had repelled countless sieges, lay fields, orchards, and the skeletal remains of once grand palaces and forums. The population had dwindled from a peak of 500,000 to perhaps a mere 50,000 souls, huddled together in scattered districts, separated by acres of desolate silence. The empire itself was a fractured relic. It consisted of the capital city, a few scattered islands in the Aegean, and the semi-autonomous despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. It was a tiny Christian island, surrounded on all sides by the ever-expanding sea of the Ottoman Sultanate. Ruling over this phantom empire was the Palaiologos dynasty, a family that had presided over centuries of decline. The reigning emperor, Constantine XV Palaiologos, ascended the throne in 1449, inheriting not a crown of glory, but a crown of thorns. He was a brave and competent leader, but he was a captain taking command of a ship that was already sinking. His predecessor, John VIII, had made a desperate gamble to save their world. He had traveled to Italy, to the Council of Florence, and formally agreed to unite the Eastern Orthodox Church with the Roman Catholic Church in exchange for military aid. But this union, born of political desperation, was a spiritual betrayal to his people. The clergy and the citizens of Constantinople met the news with outrage, famously declaring, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat." This deep-seated religious schism left the city isolated and bitterly divided, just as its greatest threat gathered on the horizon. A palpable sense of doom hung in the air, fueled by ancient prophecies foretelling the city's fall. The Byzantines were caught between their immense pride in their Roman heritage and the crushing reality of their impending extinction. In stark contrast to the twilight of Byzantium stood the dawn of a new and formidable power, the Ottoman Sultanate. While the eagle faltered, the wolf was on the prowl. Emerging from a small Anatolian principality just a century and a half earlier, the Ottomans had exploded across the region with breathtaking speed and military genius. Their state was not built on ancient lineage, but on conquest, pragmatism, and a relentless drive for expansion. At the core of this power was a revolutionary military machine. Its heart was the Janissary Corps, an elite infantry force unlike any other in the world. recruited as boys from Christian families in the Balkans through the devshirme system, they were converted to Islam and raised in absolute loyalty to the Sultan alone. They were slave soldiers, forbidden to marry or own property, their entire existence dedicated to war. Supporting them were the Sipahis, a feudal cavalry of Turkish warriors granted land in exchange for service, and a growing corps of engineers who were rapidly mastering the new and terrifying technology of gunpowder and cannons. Under the leadership of Sultan Murad II, a shrewd and capable ruler, the Ottomans had consolidated their grip on the Balkans. They had crushed a major European crusade at the Battle of Varna in 1444, a devastating blow to Christian hopes of relieving Constantinople. Murad's strategy was a slow, methodical strangulation of the city. He had already conquered nearly all of its surrounding territories in Thrace and Anatolia. He controlled the land, and increasingly, he sought to control the sea. The Byzantines could look out from their walls and see Ottoman banners flying from fortresses that were once their own. The internal politics of the Ottoman court were as ruthless as its armies. The succession was often a brutal affair, guided by an unspoken law of fratricide, where a new sultan would eliminate his brothers to prevent the civil wars that had plagued the empire in its early days. It was a system that bred ambitious, hardened rulers. As Murad II's reign drew to a close, the shadow of his empire loomed larger than ever over the Golden Horn. And within that shadow, a young prince was waiting, a man whose ambition was not just to rule the empire, but to seize the ultimate prize his ancestors had only dreamed of: the Red Apple, the city of Constantine. In 1451, Sultan Murad II died, and his 19-year-old son ascended the throne. His name was Mehmed, and the world was about to learn it. The courts of Europe, and even many of the old guard in the Ottoman capital of Edirne, breathed a sigh of relief. They saw a young, supposedly inexperienced boy, and they underestimated him. It would be the last mistake many of them ever made. Mehmed II was no ordinary prince. He was a prodigy of fierce intellect and chilling ambition. Fluent in multiple languages, he was a student of history, science, and engineering, fascinated by the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. But above all, he was consumed by a single, all-encompassing obsession that had been instilled in him since childhood: the conquest of Constantinople. For Mehmed, the city was more than a strategic prize. It was his destiny. It was the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy and the key to transforming the Ottoman state from a regional sultanate into a true world empire, the heir to Rome itself. He had briefly held the throne as a child, but his father had been forced to return from retirement to put down a crusader threat, a humiliation that had burned itself into Mehmed's soul. He would not fail a second time. His first acts as sultan were swift and ruthless, designed to signal a new era of absolute authority. He immediately ordered the execution of his infant half-brother, a common practice to prevent succession crises, but one carried out with cold finality. He then moved to secure the loyalty of the powerful Janissary Corps with lavish bonuses, ensuring his military base was unshakable. To the outside world, particularly to the anxious Byzantines, he presented a mask of peace. He renewed treaties, made promises of friendship, and lulled his future victims into a false sense of security. Emperor Constantine XI sent envoys who returned with reassurances of the young sultan's peaceful intentions. But behind this facade of diplomacy, the gears of a great war machine were already turning. Every decision, every appointment, Every coin spent was directed towards one singular goal. The young man whom the world dismissed as a boy was meticulously planning the final act in a drama that had lasted 1,000 years. In the spring of 1452, less than a year into his reign, Mehmed II dropped his peaceful facade and made his first audacious move. It was an act of architectural aggression, a declaration of war written in stone and mortar. The target was the Bosphorus, the narrow strait of water that was Constantinople's lifeline to the Black Sea and the Genoese colonies there, a potential route for grain, supplies, and Christian reinforcements. On the Asian shore of the strait already stood the Anadoluhisara, the Anatolian fortress, built by Mehmed's great-grandfather. Mehmed now ordered the construction of a new, far more massive fortress directly opposite it, on the European side, on land that was, by treaty, Byzantine. He personally selected the site, a point where the strait was at its narrowest. He called it Rumeli Hisara, the Fortress of Rumelia. It quickly earned a more sinister nickname, Boğazkesin, a Turkish name with a chilling double meaning. It meant both straight cutter and throat cutter. The message was unmistakable. Emperor Constantine XI sent frantic protests, reminding the Sultan of their treaties. Mehmed's reply was a cold dismissal of diplomacy. He declared, "I may do whatever I wish. Both shores of the Bosphorus belong to me, the one because it is inhabited by the Ottomans, and the other because you are not strong enough to defend it." The construction that followed was an engineering marvel, a testament to Ottoman resources and Mehmed's iron will. An army of over 1,000 master masons and thousands more laborers descended on the site. To speed the work, each of the 3 main towers was assigned to a different vizier, creating a competition to see who could finish first. Ancient Byzantine churches and monasteries in the area were demolished for their stone. In just over 4 months, the colossal fortress was complete. Its walls were 30 feet thick, its towers bristling with cannons. The noose around Constantinople had been pulled tight. Mehmed ordered that every ship passing through the strait must stop and pay a toll. When a Venetian vessel defied the order, the fortress's cannons blew it out of the water. The surviving crew were captured and executed. The throat cutter had claimed its first victims. The city was now completely sealed off from the north, its fate hanging by a thread. In the grand, violent theater of the 15th century, the script of warfare was being rewritten not by generals, but by engineers. And in 1452, a man named Orban, a master craftsman of Hungarian or German origin, stepped onto the stage holding the pen. He was a specialist in a new and terrifying art, the casting of enormous bronze cannons. These were not the modest field pieces of earlier decades. They were siege engines of unprecedented power, designed to render obsolete the stone fortifications that had guarded cities for 1,000 years. Initially, Orban offered his destructive genius to the very men who needed it most, the Byzantines. He presented himself at the court of Emperor Constantine XI, proposing to forge a cannon that could shatter the walls of any enemy. But the once mighty Roman Empire was a hollowed-out shell. Its treasury was bare, its resources depleted. Constantine, for all his will, could not afford the master's exorbitant price. He offered a meager salary, but it was not enough to fund the materials and labor for such a monumental undertaking. Spurned and unpaid, Orban did what any craftsman of the era would. He sought a patron who could appreciate and afford his talents. he traveled a short distance to the court of the ambitious 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. Here he found a starkly different reception. Mehmed, obsessed with the conquest of Constantinople, listened intently. When Orban boasted that his creation could blast down the very walls of Babylon, the Sultan did not scoff. He showered him with honors, provided him with 4 times the requested salary, and gave him unlimited resources. At the Ottoman capital of Edirne, a massive foundry was constructed. For 3 months, the fires never cooled as Orban and his legion of assistants toiled. They melted tons of bronze in vast crucibles, pouring the molten metal into an immense clay mold packed deep within the earth. The result was a monster of war, a bombard later known as the Basilic. It was nearly 9 meters long, with a barrel so wide a man could crawl inside. It was designed to hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton more than a mile. This single weapon, and the dozens of other large cannons that followed, represented a technological leap that sealed Constantinople's fate. The thunder of Orban's foundry was a death knell for the age of castles, and a terrifying overture to the world Mary of Burgundy would soon be born into. Destiny had placed Constantine the Fiend Palaiologos on the throne of a dying empire. He was the 8th Constantine to rule from the city of the first, but he inherited a legacy of ghosts and glories long past. Crowned in 1449, he was not a ruler of a vast, sprawling territory, but the custodian of a single, magnificent, and decaying city. Constantinople, the queen of cities, was now a pale shadow of its former self. Its population had dwindled from a peak of 500,000 to perhaps 50,000 souls, rattling within 14 miles of the world's most formidable defensive walls. Entire districts lay in ruins or had been converted to farmland. The splendors of the Hagia Sophia and the imperial palaces stood in stark contrast to the poverty and depopulation that surrounded them. Yet, the city remained the symbolic heart of Orthodox Christianity, a beacon of 1,000 years of Roman civilization. Constantine himself was a man forged in the crucible of crisis. In his earlier role as despot of the Morea in Greece, he had proven himself a capable and brave military leader, a pragmatic administrator, and a tireless defender of his people against Ottoman encroachment. He was 44 years old when he became emperor, a man in his prime, yet tasked with an impossible burden. He was respected by his subjects for his piety, his courage, and his refusal to despair in the face of overwhelming odds. But his empire was not just physically weak, it was spiritually fractured. For decades, his predecessors had sought military aid from the Catholic West, with the price being the submission of the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. This proposed union of the churches was anathema to the majority of the Byzantine clergy and populace, who famously declared they would rather see the Sultan's turban in the city than the Latin mitre. Constantine, a pragmatist, understood that only Western aid could save him. He allowed the union to be formally proclaimed in the Hagia Sophia in late 1452, an act that alienated many of his most devout subjects. He found himself a lonely figure, trying to unite a divided people against a monolithic threat, shouldering the weight of a millennium as he prepared to defend his city to the last. As the Ottoman war machine geared up, Constantine V knew his small garrison could not hold the city alone. The fate of Constantinople, and perhaps all of Eastern Christendom, rested on the hope of a grand crusade from the West. Desperate diplomatic missions fanned out across Europe, carrying pleas for immediate military and financial aid. The emperor's envoys sailed to Venice, the city's ancient rival and sometime ally, whose commercial interests in the east were now gravely threatened. They journeyed to Genoa, whose colony of Pera sat just across the Golden Horn, and whose bankers and merchants had long profited from Constantinople. They traveled to the papal court in Rome, reminding Pope Nicholas V of his duty as the spiritual head of Christendom to protect the faithful from the infidel. Appeals were sent to King Alfonso V of Aragon and Naples, a powerful maritime ruler, and to the other fragmented states of Italy. But the Europe that received these pleas was a continent weary of crusades and consumed by its own internal conflicts. The 100 Years' War between England and France had only just sputtered to a close, leaving both kingdoms exhausted. The Italian city-states were locked in their own intricate web of rivalries, more likely to fight each other than to unite against a common foe. Venice, ever the pragmatist, debated endlessly, weighing the cost of a war with the Sultan against the potential loss of their trading posts. They would send ships, but too few and too late. The Genoese were similarly conflicted, officially neutral, but allowing individuals to volunteer. The Pope, for his part, was sympathetic, but lacked the political and military power to compel the princes of Europe to act. He sent a cardinal and a small contingent of archers, but his calls for a larger force fell on deaf ears. The German Emperor, Frederick III, was distracted by troubles within the Holy Roman Empire. The tragic reality was that Constantinople had become a geopolitical afterthought. To the powerful rulers of the West, it was a distant, schismatic city, a relic of a bygone era. The urgency that animated Constantine's court was met with apathy and empty promises. The failure of this diplomatic offensive highlighted the deep fractures in Christendom and the rising tide of national interest over religious unity, the very political landscape that would later define the struggles of Mary of Burgundy. While Constantine's envoys begged for help in the courts of Europe, Sultan Mehmed II was orchestrating one of the most formidable military gatherings of the age. This was to be no mere raid. It was a meticulously planned campaign of annihilation, driven by a singular, burning ambition. The first overt act of aggression came in the summer of 1452, a clear signal of his intent. On the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait, just a few miles north of Constantinople, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive fortress, Rumelihisari, or the Throat Cutter. Built directly opposite an existing fortress on the Asian side, it gave the Ottomans complete control of the strait, severing the city's maritime link to potential aid from Genoese colonies on the Black Sea. The fortress was completed in a breathtaking 4 months, its walls built in a pattern that formed the name of the Prophet Muhammad. Any ship that tried to pass without paying tribute was sunk by its powerful cannons. The noose was tightening. By the spring of 1453, the storm was ready to break. From across the vast expanse of the Ottoman Empire, troops converged on the plains outside the city. The numbers were staggering. Contemporary accounts vary, but modern historians estimate Mehmed's regular army numbered around 80,000 elite professional soldiers. This corps included thousands of janissaries, the Sultan's household troops, fanatically loyal and raised from childhood for war. They were supported by tens of thousands more irregulars, the Bashi Bazouks, drawn to the siege by the promise of plunder. An enormous fleet of over 100 ships, commanded by Admiral Baltoglu, blockaded the city from the Sea of Marmara. But the heart of this terrifying force was the artillery train. The great bombards cast by Orban and others were hauled from Edirne by teams of 60 oxen each, with hundreds of men working to smooth the road ahead of them. This was a logistical masterpiece, a clear demonstration of the immense resources and organizational power at Mehmed's command. On April 2, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II himself arrived, riding at the head of his army. He pitched his crimson tent just beyond the range of the city's defenders, directly opposite the central St. Romanus Gate. The vast, sprawling camp of the Ottoman host filled the horizon, an endless sea of men and steel ready to extinguish the last flicker of the Roman flame. The news of Charles the Bold's death at the Battle of Nancy on January 5, 1477, spread like a contagion, not of grief, but of avarice and ambition. For 19-year-old Mary, now Duchess of Burgundy, the city was not a single fortress, but her entire, sprawling inheritance, a patchwork of duchies, counties, and lordships stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps. And the siege began almost immediately. The principal besieger was the most dangerous man in Europe, King Louis XV of France, the Universal Spider. He had been Charles's lifelong nemesis, and with his rival dead, he saw his chance to dismantle the Burgundian state once and for all. He acted with breathtaking speed, renouncing the treaties that bound him and declaring Mary's key territories, the Duchy of Burgundy and Picardy, forfeit to the French crown. His armies marched not as liberators, but as conquerors, to invest the city, to surround and cut off Mary's domains. The investment was not merely military. It was a masterful campaign of political and psychological warfare. Louis sent emissaries to the great semi-autonomous cities of Flanders and Brabant, Ghent, Bruges, Brussels, poisoning them against their new, young, and female ruler. He stoked the fires of their long-held desire for greater freedom from ducal authority, promising them ancient rights and privileges if they would only abandon Mary. Within her own court, loyalty wavered. The structure her father had built through force and fear began to crumble without him. The grand nobles, who had prospered under Charles, now looked to their own survival, some secretly negotiating with the French king. Mary found herself isolated, a sovereign in name, but a prisoner in her own palace at Ghent. The walls of her inheritance were being tested from without by French steel, and from within by the corrosive acid of rebellion and betrayal. Every dispatch brought worse news. A town had fallen, a noble had defected, a city was in open revolt. The siege was total, a suffocating pressure designed to break her spirit and force her to surrender her birthright, piece by piece. Her reign did not begin with a coronation. It began with the desperate defense of a realm under total assault. To withstand a siege, a ruler must secure the heart of their domain. For Mary, the Golden Horn, the source of her wealth and power, was not a harbor, but the fabulously rich and fiercely independent cities of the Low Countries. Yet these cities were her most volatile asset. They had chafed under her father's centralizing authoritarian rule, and saw in his death an opportunity to reclaim their autonomy. To guard this vital core of her state, Mary could not rely on armies she barely controlled. Instead, she had to forge a different kind of defense, a great chain of law and liberty to bind her subjects to her cause not by force, but by consent. On February 11, 1477, in Ghent, she did just that. She granted the great privilege a landmark charter of rights that effectively rolled back decades of ducal consolidation of power. This was a monumental concession. It abolished the central court of Mechlin, her father's primary instrument of control, and guaranteed the ancient rights of the towns and provinces. It stipulated that the Duchess could not declare war, raise taxes, or even marry without the consent of the Estates General, the representative assembly of her domains. In essence, Mary was shackling herself, creating a constitutional monarchy centuries ahead of its time. This great chain was a calculated gamble of immense proportions. She was voluntarily surrendering vast swathes of her own sovereign power, an act unthinkable to her father or to her rival, Louis XV. Her advisors were aghast, seeing it as a sign of weakness. But Mary understood her position with stark clarity. The loyalty of Flanders, Brabant, and Holland was the only true defense she had against French aggression. By chaining her own authority to the will of her people, she was forging a stronger, more resilient bond than any forged in steel. She was transforming her subjects from resentful vassals into active partners in the defense of their shared homeland, hoping this chain would be strong enough to hold the gates against the French tide. The ink on the great privilege was barely dry when the battering of Mary's land walls began in earnest. King Louis XV was not a man to be deterred by charters or concessions. He viewed Mary's attempts to pacify her subjects as a sign of desperation, and he intensified his assaults. The French army, the most professional fighting force in Europe, stormed through the Duchy of Burgundy, its ancestral heartland, and Picardy. The great city of Dijon, the historic capital of the Valois dukes, fell with barely a fight, its gates opened by citizens who saw more advantage in siding with the powerful French king than with a distant, untested Duchess. This was the first great crack in the walls of her state. But the most devastating blows came not from external enemies, but from within her own council. The political turmoil in Ghent reached a fever pitch. The rebellious city, emboldened by the great privilege, sought to purge the government of those they considered corrupt and overly loyal to the old regime. Their wrath fell upon two of Mary's most senior and trusted advisors, her chancellor, Guillaume Huguenet, and the seer d'Ambercourt. The Ghenters accused them of treason, claiming they had engaged in secret, unauthorized negotiations with France. In a shocking display of popular fury, they were arrested, subjected to a sham trial, and condemned to death. Mary, their sovereign, was powerless to intervene. She personally went before the city's assembly, weeping and begging for the lives of her loyal servants. The mob, however, was implacable. On April 3, 1477, she was forced to watch from a window as Huguenet and d'Ambercourt were publicly beheaded in the Ghent marketplace. This brutal act was a terrifying assault on her authority. It demonstrated that even in her own capital, she was a virtual prisoner. The execution shattered the illusion of unity her great privilege was meant to foster, and sent a chilling message to all who remained loyal to her. The walls of her duchy were not just being battered from the outside, they were being torn down from the inside. With her lands ablaze with war and rebellion, and her authority drowning in a sea of political turmoil, Mary of Burgundy faced a desperate struggle. This was a conflict of fire and water, of heated passions and treacherous diplomatic currents. The metaphorical naval struggle was not fought with ships, but with marriage contracts, a battle for an alliance that could save her from being consumed by France. King Louis XV, ever the spider, offered a disingenuous solution. Mary should marry his 7-year-old son, the Dauphin Charles. This was a transparent trap. The marriage would subordinate her domains to the French crown, effectively achieving through matrimony what he was attempting through war. It was an offer of peace that meant total surrender. Mary's subjects in the Low Countries, particularly the fiercely anti-French Ghenters, were horrified by the prospect. They had executed her ministers for merely talking to the French. They would never accept a French prince as their master. The fire of their rebellion would become an inferno. Across the water, in England, lay another potential ally. A match with an English prince. Perhaps the brother of King Edward IV was considered. But England was wary of being drawn into another costly war with France. The diplomatic waters were choppy and unreliable. This left one primary candidate, one championed by her stepmother, Margaret of York, and one who represented a complete defiance of Louis XV, Maximilian of Habsburg, son and heir of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III. The Habsburgs were the great rivals of the French monarchy. An alliance with them would not bring peace. It would guarantee a wider war. It meant choosing to fight fire with fire. The pressure on Mary was immense. Her council was divided. Her cities were demanding a voice, and Louis's armies were still on the march. In this crucible of fire and water, the young Duchess had to navigate her own course. Her choice would not just determine her own fate, but would set the stage for the next 2 centuries of European conflict. She chose fire. In the spring of 1477, she formally sent her proposal to Maximilian, a decision made of her own free will, defying both her enemy and her overbearing subjects. She was choosing a partner in the struggle, not a master. To comprehend the world Mary of Burgundy was born into just 4 years later, we must first turn our eyes to the East, to a cataclysm that redefined the boundaries of power and faith. In the spring of 1453, the ancient city of Constantinople, the bastion of Eastern Christendom, was besieged by the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II. The city's defenders, though vastly outnumbered, held one crucial advantage: a massive iron chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the city's primary harbor. This barrier rendered Mehmed's formidable navy useless, preventing any assault on the weaker sea walls within. For weeks, the siege ground on, with the legendary Theodosian land walls repelling every attack. But Mehmed was no ordinary conqueror. He was a visionary, a student of history and engineering, and he conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. If he could not sail his ships into the Golden Horn, he would bring them there by land. It was a scheme that bordered on the impossible, a feat worthy of Hannibal or Alexander. Under the cloak of darkness, his engineers set to work. A road of greased wooden logs was constructed over the steep hill of Galata. Thousands of soldiers and oxen were marshaled, and under the thunderous cover of cannon fire to distract the Byzantines, an entire fleet of some 70 small galleys was hauled out of the Bosphorus. They were dragged up the steep incline and then slid down the other side, splashing one by one into the protected waters of the Golden Horn. When dawn broke on April 22nd, the defenders of Constantinople looked upon a sight that shattered their morale. A hostile fleet now sat in their safe harbor, a miracle of logistics and brute force. This singular act of military genius signaled that the old rules of warfare were obsolete. It was a terrifying demonstration of Ottoman ambition and ingenuity. a shockwave that would soon reach the courts of Burgundy and France, shaping the strategic anxieties of the world Mary would inherit. The sudden appearance of the Ottoman fleet inside the Golden Horn was a strategic catastrophe for the defenders of Constantinople. Their security had been predicated on the invulnerability of their harbor, allowing them to concentrate their limited forces on the formidable land walls. Now that assumption was shattered. The city's defensive line, already stretched perilously thin over miles of fortifications, was suddenly doubled. Emperor Constantine X had to divert precious soldiers and resources to man the sea walls, which had been neglected for centuries and were far weaker than their landward counterparts. The siege was transformed into a grueling two-front war. From the west, Mehmed's supercannons, including the monstrous bombard cast by the engineer Orban, continued their relentless pounding of the Theodosian walls, turning ancient stone to dust. From the north, the newly positioned fleet began its own bombardment, while pontoon bridges were constructed to bring soldiers even closer to the vulnerable harbor defenses. The psychological pressure was immense. The defenders, a mix of Byzantines, Genoese, and Venetians, were exhausted, sleep-deprived, and now beset from every direction. The brilliant Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, raced from breach to breach on the land walls, shoring up defenses and inspiring his men, while the emperor himself fought alongside his soldiers, a symbol of doomed defiance. The coordinated assault showcased a new, terrifyingly modern form of warfare, one of combined arms where naval power and artillery worked in concert. This was the new military reality of the late 15th century, a lesson that would not be lost on the rulers of Western Europe. The brutal efficiency on display at Constantinople would soon be mirrored in the conflicts that would define Mary of Burgundy's reign, as she fought to protect her own inheritance from the cannons and armies of a rapacious king of France. While the world watched the dramatic bombardments by land and sea, a hidden war was being waged deep beneath the earth. Mehmed, relentless in his quest to find any weakness, employed a corps of expert miners, many of them Serbs conscripted from the silver mines of Novoburdo, to dig tunnels beneath the Theodosian walls. Their goal was simple and terrifying: to excavate the foundations, plant explosives, or light fires, and bring a section of the mighty fortifications crashing down from below. This subterranean threat added a new dimension of horror for the besieged. The defenders, however, had their own expert. A Scottish engineer named Johannes Grant devised a brilliant system of countermining. He and his men would place bowls of water along the inner fortifications. The subtle vibrations on the water's surface would betray the direction of the enemy's digging. Once a tunnel was located, Grant's counterminers would dig furiously to intercept it. The battles that followed were the stuff of nightmares, fought in claustrophobic darkness, hundreds of feet underground, with picks, shovels, and swords. The Byzantines employed their most feared and secret weapon in this subterranean war: Greek fire. Pumped through siphons into the Ottoman tunnels, this mysterious incendiary substance, which could burn on water, incinerated the enemy sappers in their tracks. For weeks, Grant and his men successfully located and destroyed every tunnel the Ottomans dug, winning a desperate, unseen battle. This struggle highlighted the escalating role of technology and specialized skills in 15th century conflict. The age of chivalric charges was giving way to an era of calculated engineering and brutal scientific warfare. This was the world Mary of Burgundy was about to be born into. A world where victory depended not just on the courage of knights, but on the ingenuity of engineers and the grim determination of men fighting in the dark. In the final days of the siege, as food dwindled and the cannonade never ceased, the city's morale began to crumble under the weight of perceived divine disapproval. To the 15th century mind, the will of God was manifest in the signs and portents of the natural world. And for Constantinople, all the signs pointed toward doom. An ancient prophecy foretold that the city would fall when the moon, its symbol, was in eclipse. On May 22nd, a lunar eclipse plunged the crescent moon into darkness, casting a terrifying shadow over the city and the hearts of its people. A few days later, a procession carrying a sacred icon of the Virgin Mary, the city's protector, slipped and fell, a horrifying omen that she had abandoned them. Then, an unnaturally thick fog, unheard of in late May, descended upon the city for a full day, isolating it in a silent, gray shroud. But the most terrible sign came on the night before the final assault. Witnesses reported a strange, unholy light flickering around the dome of the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Eastern Christendom. Theologians and common folk alike interpreted it as the Holy Spirit itself departing the city, leaving it to its fate. This succession of portents was a devastating psychological blow, far more effective than any cannon. In the face of what seemed to be God's own judgment, hope withered. This profound belief in destiny and divine will was the very fabric of Mary of Burgundy's world. The fall of the Second Rome was not just a military defeat for Christendom, it was a theological crisis. It fueled apocalyptic fears and a desperate desire for a new champion of the faith. This event created a spiritual and political vacuum, one that shaped the ambitions and alliances of every European court, including the Burgundian court Mary would one day lead. The world she inherited was one haunted by the ghosts of Constantinople, a world where faith and prophecy were powerful weapons of state. In the bitter January of 1477, the frozen fields of Nancy held more than just the mutilated body of Charles the Bold. They held the fractured future of Burgundy. For his sole heir, the 19-year-old Mary, grief was a luxury she could not afford. The moment news of her father's demise reached the royal court of France, King Louis XV, the universal spider, began to spin his web. He saw not the tragedy of a young orphan, but the unparalleled opportunity to dismantle the rival power that had plagued the French crown for generations. His actions were swift, brutal, and absolute, resembling less a negotiation between sovereigns and more the ultimatum of a conquering sultan. Messengers were dispatched not with condolences, but with demands that were as sharp as a headsman's axe. The ultimatum was twofold, yet singular in its goal: the complete absorption of the Burgundian state. The first path was surrender through marriage. Mary was to wed Louis's 7-year-old son, the Dauphin Charles. This would be a dynastic annexation, a velvet glove hiding an iron fist, ensuring her vast territories would eventually fall under direct French rule. Her titles, her power, her very identity would be subsumed into the House of Valois. The second path was far more direct: destruction. If she refused the marriage, Louis declared her a rebellious vassal and her fiefdoms forfeit to the French crown. He immediately sent his armies crashing into the Duchy of Burgundy and Picardy, seizing the ancestral heartland of her dynasty without a formal declaration of war. Mary was trapped. Her father's armies were shattered, his treasury bled dry by years of ceaseless conflict. Her own subjects in the wealthy cities of Flanders and Brabant were seething with resentment over decades of heavy taxation and the erosion of their traditional rights. They were on the brink of open revolt, more of a threat than an asset. From her palace in Ghent, Mary looked at the map of Europe and saw her magnificent inheritance being torn apart. To the south, the French wolf was devouring her lands. Within her own cities, the wolves of rebellion were circling. Louis XIV's message was clear: bend the knee and become a pawn, or stand defiant and be erased from history. For the wealthiest heiress in Europe, all the gold in Bruges and Antwerp could not buy her a moment of peace. She was a queen with no army, a duchess with no allies, facing a choice between subjugation and annihilation. While the French armies tore at the borders of her realm, a more insidious crisis was imploding within its very heart. In the great cities of the Low Countries, the death of Charles the Bold was not a moment for mourning, but for opportunity. The powerful guilds and burghers of Ghent, Bruges, and Brussels saw Mary's weakness as their strength. For decades, they had chafed under the centralizing, autocratic rule of her father. Now they intended to reclaim their lost power. The ensuing confrontation was a political ceremony of submission, a final solemn service for the absolute power the Dukes of Burgundy had once wielded. It was a last liturgy for an old world, held not in a cathedral of stone, but in the tumultuous public squares and council halls of Ghent. This city, the metaphorical Hagia Sophia of her Burgundian inheritance, became the stage for her humiliation. The Estates General, the assembly of her subjects, convened not to offer support, but to issue demands. They presented her with a charter of rights, the Groot Privilege, or Great Privilege. It was a revolutionary document that systematically dismantled her father's life's work, restoring ancient town privileges, abolishing central courts, and requiring the consent of the estates for war or taxation. To ensure her compliance, the leaders of Ghent made a terrifying show of force. They arrested and tried two of her father's most loyal and senior advisors, the Chancellor Guillaume Huguenet and the Sire d'Umbercourt. Despite Mary's desperate, public pleas for their lives, weeping before the magistrates and the assembled crowd, the men were summarily beheaded in the Vrijdagmarkt. Their execution was a brutal message. Her ducal authority was gone. She was a ruler in name only, a prisoner of her own people. On February 11, 1477, Mary, cornered and powerless, formally signed the Great Privilege. With each stroke of the quill, she surrendered a piece of her sovereignty. It was a public farewell to the dream of a unified, powerful Burgundian kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. She had bought internal peace at the price of her own power, a necessary sacrifice to face the external threat. But the ceremony left her utterly isolated, stripped of her father's trusted counsel and a significant portion of her royal prerogative. The liturgy was over. The absolute ducal monarchy was dead. Having been forced to pacify her own rebellious subjects, Mary could now turn her full attention to the existential threat massing on her borders. King Louis XV had not been idle. Taking her lack of a direct response as defiance, he unleashed his armies in a full-scale invasion. These were not feudal levies, but the disciplined, professional soldiers of the French Standing Army, funded by the crown and loyal only to the king. In their relentless advance and brutal efficiency, They were like janissaries at the gates of her fractured domain, intent on overwhelming her defenses and dismantling her state piece by piece. The final assault on the Burgundian Inheritance had begun. The French war machine rolled through the Duchy of Burgundy, capturing the capital, Dijon, with little resistance. The region, the ancient homeland of her ancestors, was lost almost immediately. Next, they pushed into the Franche-Comté and north into Artois and Picardy, besieging towns and castles that had stood loyal to her father for decades. The war was a brutal, grinding affair. Mary's forces, disorganized and demoralized after the disaster at Nancy, struggled to mount a coherent defense. She had no great general to lead them, and the funds promised by the Estates General were slow to materialize. Every dispatch brought more news of defeat, of another town surrendering to the French onslaught. The metaphorical gates of her realm were buckling under the immense pressure. The city of Arras, a key strategic possession, was a particular focus of Louis's wrath. After a bitter siege, it fell. To make an example of it, Louis expelled its leading citizens, renamed the city Franchise, and repopulated it with loyal French subjects. It was an act of cultural and political erasure designed to terrorize other towns into submission. Mary, now residing in Bruges, worked tirelessly to rally support. She wrote letters to potential allies, pleaded with the estates for more soldiers and money, and tried to project an image of strength and resolve. But she knew it was not enough. The French army was too large, too well organized, and too relentless. She could not fight this war alone. The continued advance of Louis's forces was the ultimate catalyst. It became painfully clear that the only way to save what was left of her inheritance was to secure a powerful military alliance, an alliance that could only be sealed through marriage. The final assault was forcing her hand, pushing her towards the one candidate her father had once considered: Maximilian of Austria, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The dream of a great Burgundian Middle Kingdom, a powerful empire of wine, wool, and wealth stretching between France and Germany, died in the mud of 1477. The fall was swift and brutal. The ancestral Duchy of Burgundy, the heart of her Valois-Burgundy dynasty, was lost forever, absorbed back into the French crown from which it had sprung centuries earlier. This partition marked the end of an era, the collapse of the political project pursued for 4 generations by her ancestors. It was, in effect, the fall of the Burgundian Empire. Yet, from these ashes, a new world was about to begin, one that would reshape the destiny of Europe in ways no one could have foreseen. The catalyst for this new world was Mary's momentous decision. Rejecting the French ultimatum, she turned instead to the House of Habsburg, sending a secret message to the 20-year-old Archduke Maximilian of Austria. In August 1477, in a ceremony in Ghent, Mary of Burgundy married Maximilian. This was no mere marriage of convenience, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The union fused the immense commercial wealth and strategic territories of the Burgundian Low Countries with the imperial prestige and military potential of the Habsburgs. It was the birth of the Habsburg-Burgundian Axis. Maximilian, a brave and chivalrous warrior, immediately took command of the war effort. He brought with him German soldiers and a renewed sense of purpose, personally leading the armies that would finally halt the French advance at the Battle of Guinegate in 1479. While the war would continue for years, the immediate threat of total annihilation was over. The marriage secured the future of the Low Countries, which would remain a Habsburg possession for 3 centuries. More importantly, it laid the foundation for a global dynasty. Mary and Maximilian had 2 children, Philip the Handsome and Margaret of Austria. It was Philip's marriage to Joanna of Castile that would unite the Burgundian Habsburg inheritance with the vast Spanish Empire. Their son, Charles V, would inherit it all, ruling an empire on which the sun literally never set. The fall of Burgundy as an independent power was the direct cause of the rise of the Habsburgs as the dominant force in Europe. Mary's desperate choice, made in a moment of extreme crisis, redrew the map. It created the very superpower that would challenge France for the next 200 years. A new world had indeed begun, forged not in victory, but in the strategic survival of a young duchess who refused to be erased.